Started. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a concept called Hatmana. Hatmana, on the surface of it, doesn't look like something that we really do anymore today, but we're going to see that it has some questions that we have to relate to. Hatmana means wrapping a hot food in some kind of item that's going to help it either preserve the heat or potentially even heat it up. Now, again, we don't really do this. Not the way that we prepare food. We have many kinds of sophisticated devices, right? We have, in every house, we have a very easy to use oven, hot plates, and so on and so forth. So to think about the idea of taking a dish and wrapping it up in some kind of material, and that somehow is going to heat up the food in any real substantial way, we wouldn't consider it. But in the time of the Gemara, this was a major idea and a major concept. So we do have to relate to it. So what would they do? They would wrap something in a it depends what, right? So like you have a pot of, I don't know, let's say pasta that you want to cook, right? What would they do? They would either have it on a stove and then take it off the stove while it was hot and wrap it up in like a scarf or something. And the scarf could theoretically maintain the heat of that pot longer than if you just left it sitting out. So that would be something that they would do. Or there were certain materials that we're going to learn about that, like the residue of olives, right? The pressed olives. If you have a bin of this stuff and you take something that's hot and you put it in there, not only will it keep the heat, it might actually make it hotter, right? That was the way that it worked. So we're going to see there's different types of materials. Some just maintained the heat, and some actually would increase the heat of the object. So that's something to keep in mind. So let's talk about what we're allowed to do or not allowed to do. Asur lahatmin b'Shabbat tavshil cham shayad soledet bo v'odo b'kli shenitbashel bo. Says it's forbidden to wrap up or to do what we're calling hatmana, a dish, a cooked dish that is still hot. How hot? Yad soledet bo, that degree of temperature we've been talking about, real substantial heat. If it's in the utensil that it was heated in, right? So it's in the kli rishon. I took it off the fire, and and it doesn't matter if I'm wrapping it in something that will add to its heat, or even if it's something that just simply preserves and maintains the heat. Either way, I'm not allowed to do it. But if the item is no longer hot of yad soledet bo, or if you put it in a different utensil, right, in a kli sheni, and even more so if it's already cold, on Shabbat, you can wrap it in something if that something doesn't increase the heat. It only preserves. But if it's something that increases the heat, then you can't put it in, right? So again, you can't put it in something that increases the heat no matter what. If it's something that only preserves the heat, if it's either not so hot or it's no longer in the utensil that was on the fire, the kli rishon, then it's allowed to do it. So that's the general thing, okay? Now, he says, Mutar larot b'Shabbat metoch mecham haomed ala esh, mayim chamim shayad soledet bo. It says, the toch termus, kedei l'shmor al chom hamayim, ve'em bazeh isur hatmana. He says, placing something in a thermos, what we use to kind of preserve heat today, right? None of us would really use a scarf or leftover squeezed olives, right? Neither of these are things that we would really use today. We would use a thermos. He says there's no problem of using a thermos. A thermos is allowed. So if you take, if you made some hot tea, hot water, now you want to take it off the fire and you want to put it into a thermos, it's not a problem. You're allowed to do that. Okay? You had a question, Abe, or no? No. Okay, good. Mutar latet b'Shabbat tavshil afil mukli shnepashel bo vayad soledet bo b'toch mitkan l'shmirat chom atavshil shumtza la'acharona שעשוי כאין קופסה ומכניסים לתוכו את הגדרה וסוגרים אותו בכיסוי שלו. So he says, today you have a lot of these, what you'll call preserving boxes. It's like a heat preserver box. He says you're allowed to put something into that box because it's not the same as Hatmana. The way Hatmana works is that the heat is preserved because it's completely wrapped and sealed around it. But since the way these new objects work, these new boxes that you preserve heat in, don't work that way, so it's not a problem to put something into that box. So therefore, that's going to be fine. And he says, of course, the same holds true about making something cold, right? In other words, let's say I have a bottle of water, and I want it to be cold for lunchtime, so I might in the morning on Shabbat put it in the fridge. Can I do that, right? I'm going to make the water cold. And the answer is yes, you can do that. There's no problem with that. Partly because we're not, the bishul is more about making something hot. But second of all, because the way that it makes it cold isn't by wrapping it, but actually some other method, being in an area that's cold. So that's not a problem. Another thing that you might think is a problem and then is not, and we've talked about this already, is let's say you have something that's cold, that a cold liquid, like a baby bottle, that you want to make a little bit warmer. Can I take it and put it into a cup of hot water? And the answer is you are allowed to put it into a cup of hot water, provided the cup is a kli sheni, right? Provided the cup is a kli sheni. It can't be in a kli rishon, but it can be in a kli sheni. Okay. Good, we did that. Okay, 1 second. Okay, something that's not allowed to do on Shabbat, which, okay, he's kind of relating here, is you're not allowed to stir a pot that's on the fire. So you have to be careful. Let's say you have something sitting on the blech or something like that. You can't go and stir that item. Once it's on the fire, you're not supposed to touch it. So even you have to be careful. You're allowed to take something out to serve, but you're not allowed to stir the pot. Okay, so stirring the pot is not allowed. Another thing that's not allowed is you're not allowed to cover a pot. What do I mean? You have an open pot sitting, on the blech or the hot plate, and it's open and there's something in it, and you say, it would cook much better and much faster if I came and put a cover on that pot, right? Which it would cook better. You're not allowed to put that cover on the pot. You're not allowed to cover something. However, if the something was already covered, you are allowed to return the cover onto the pot. So for example, you took the cover off to see how it's doing. Right now it's not covered, right? You can put it back on because it was there. Different people have different levels of stringency on this point, but basically you can return a cover to it. And even if it was a covered item, you can add to the cover, right? So for example, let's say it was a pot that was covered, and if you feel, by placing an additional item on top of it, it's going to make it even better, you're still allowed to do that if there was a cover on it to begin with. Okay. Next topic, next piece is what about from before Shabbat, right? Everything we've been talking about is wrapping it, covering it, and so on Shabbat. What about before Shabbat? So he says like this: before Shabbat, you're not allowed to do the Hatmana in something that increases the heat. But before Shabbat, you're allowed to wrap it in something that preserves the heat, no matter what, right? Even if it's hot, even if it's the first utensil and so on, you're allowed to wrap it in something that preserves the heat, but not something that maintains the heat. So now, again, a lot of this is just not so relevant to the way we do things today, but we're just learning, basically a Mishnah right now, which this is the type of material. There's two different types of materials. It says these are the materials that add to the heat. By the way, if you're doing daf yomi, this was like about 3 weeks ago in the Daf Yomi. So these are the things that add to the heat. Psolet shel zetim or shel shumshamin. The residue of olives or of sesame seeds. Zevel, manure. Melach, salt. Seeds, some kind of plaster. Bechol, or sand, whether it be moist or dry. Teven, straw. Tzemer gefen, cotton. Ugrirat begadim bluim asavim bizman shem lachim, or leftover remnants of clothing if they're moist. Right? All of these things had the capacity to increase heat on a pot if that pot was already hot. So therefore, all of those things are forbidden to surround and wrap the utensil in. So what are things that don't increase heat? So karim uksatot, pillows and blankets, wool, cotton. Even though we said before a certain type of cotton could be a problem, but fruit, sawdust, things like that, the remnants of flax. These are things that were allowed to. Those were things that don't add, so they're more lenient. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on it. I think we already spent too much time on it because it's not something that we really do today. So I'm going to skip a halacha or two. Now we're going to talk about something. Okay, so he says like this: Tavshil shalonit bashel kol tzorcho me'erev Shabbat. You have a dish that was not fully cooked before Shabbat, right? In other words, it's Friday afternoon, right? It's 3 o'clock, and the Shabbat starts at 6. And what you need to cook in order to eat it maybe needs 8 hours of cooking, right? So there's not enough time to cook it all completely before Shabbat, right? He says you're allowed to leave it on Erev Shabbat on the fire or the hot plate in order to be able to eat it on Shabbat, even though it's cooking on Shabbat, right? Meaning it started and it was sort of partially cooked while it was Friday, but it was certainly not ready to be eaten. And the fact that it was cooking on Shabbat wasn't just preserving the heat; it was continuing to cook the item. It's still allowed. He says, of course, as we've said before, better that if you're putting it on the stovetop, that there be some kind of blech or something like that, or as we've said also, to either remove or cover the buttons to the stove. He says because there is a concern that the Chachamim expressed that if you were to see something sitting on the fire that's cooking, that you might come along and say, let me just raise the temperature a little bit, it'll cook better or faster. Or if there were coals there, that you might stoke the coals or something like that. So that's why the Chachamim said, place a blech and you won't touch the stuff. Or as we said, remove the buttons or cover it up or something like that to show you not to touch it. So that is a better thing to do. Okay, fine. It says, "V'tavshil sheyesh bo basar shelon etpashel klal, or tavshil shetchil etpashel ma'at v'natan letocho samuch l'knisat Shabbat chetcha basar shelon mevushelet mutar shoter b'Shabbat al esh gluya." He says, but where's a classic example of this? Right, is cholent. Right, the cholent. Right, what do people like to do? You put it in Friday afternoon, and you're going to eat it on Shabbat morning. Right, and you put it in this crock pot item. And you leave it sitting. If you go to it on Friday night, and they have like the glass tops that you could look on Friday night, it's not cooked, right? You would not eat it on Friday night. It's still needs a lot more cooking. So, but that's okay. You could do that, no problem, because you left it on from before Shabbat. Now, what about all that was on a stove? What about on the oven, right? Which was a question that was asked the other day. So the same thing about before Shabbat applies to an oven, right? You are allowed to, before Shabbat, place a dish into the oven, whether it be gas or electric, whether the item was mostly cooked or only partly cooked, or even at the time you put it in, not cooked at all, as long as you put it in before Shabbat. And your plan is to take it out on Shabbat. There's no problem. You're able to do that. why isn't this Hatmana? It's not Hatmana because, as we said, Hatmana only applies when the item is completely wrapped. Here, if you put it in your oven, there's space in the oven, so it's not a problem. Now, there are some people who are concerned that if you put it in an oven, then when you open the door to the oven will do what? It will sense that it got cooler, and the flame will pick up, right? If there's like a thermostat, right? You know, like your oven tries to stay at 350, right? And how does it know to get to 350? There's a thermometer inside, and it measures the temperature, right? So when you turned it on before Shabbat, fine, right? So it goes to 350, whatever it does, what it does, right? But when I open it on Shabbat, what happens? It gets colder in the oven. Then, since it gets colder, what does the oven do? It starts to work harder, right? But we don't take that into account. That's fine. So on before Shabbat, if we have something that we put in the oven, it's not a problem. You can take it out and eat it on Shabbat. But as we've said, our general opinion is that we do not put something in the oven on Shabbat. That's generally not okay. However, I will tell you that there are some opinions that do allow that, provided you've done some kind of button covering or something of that nature, button removal. It's a little harder on the stove, but on the oven, but it is doable. It is practical. So it's not what I'll call the mainstream custom, but I know that there are some people in the community that do have this custom. So if you have the custom, it's, there's what to rely upon, but you should make some kind of sign on the, it could be actually a sign where you say, don't touch the buttons, right? But something that prevents you from adjusting the fire in one way or another. So there's what to say, but in general, what I, kind of promote is, you can put stuff in the oven before Shabbat, but I wouldn't recommend putting it on Shabbat. You could put things on the stove on Shabbat, provided there's some kind of blech or it's a hot plate or something like that, where the sign is there that you're not going to touch it. So that's the halachot in regards to that. Any questions on any of this? I know we did a lot of different things.
Rabbi, just in regards to the stove and the instead of taking off the buttons, can you tape them up?
That's fine. Yeah, right. I mean, some of them, the buttons don't come off.
That wouldn't be instead of a blech, it'd be in addition to, for the most part, or?
So I would recommend in addition, but I would tell you that if you just do that, it's okay. So like, I'll give you what you could do, right? Like, let's say, you're at an Airbnb, right? Or something like that, So in your home, you should set it up the right way. But sometimes when you go to an Airbnb, you don't have it, especially if you get there, right before Shabbat or something like that, right? So what could you do? You could put tape over the buttons, or tin foil over the buttons, or something like that, which before you would go and adjust the fire, you'd say, oh, wait, I won't touch it because that's there. That would be fine.
Thank
you. Rabbi, I have a question.
Go ahead, Neil.
You said that you cannot stir the pot.
Correct.
When I guess it's on the fire, but once you take the pot off the fire, can you stir it?
Then it would be okay. I would actually, I think even, hold on, even when you take it, one second, I just want to see that. Yeah, even in the pot that you took off the fire, if it's the pot that you took off the fire and it's still in there, you can't stir it to make it hot. You can right? Even that.
But you're saying when you take it off the stove or the oven, you can't stir it
in that pot. I could stir it in a different pot, right? Meaning, like let's say I could take it, right? Let's say it's a soup, right? So I take the soup, I take it off the oven. When it's on the oven, I can't stir it. That's super bad. I take it off the oven and I stir it. Still can't do that. What I can do is I could take it off the oven, pour it into a separate pot, and then I could stir it.
Wow. Okay.
Stirring it is Stirring it, actually, you're actively making things happen, so it's considered a problem. Stirring is a real thing. As we said, is covering it, right? If it was uncovered and it was never covered before, putting a cover on it and stirring it, those are two things that are no-goes. Okay. Now, there's another issue, which I guess. All right, we'll try and do it now. He says like this: Hanotel b'Shabbat sim al gabei esh ubo tafshin shel kol tzorcho mutar lachziro b'Shabbat. He says, let's say you had something that was on the fire, and now it cooked, right? And now you took it off the fire, and you want to put it back onto the fire. Are you allowed to do so? So he says, if the utensil. So he says, if it depends what we're talking about, right? So we want to know, right? In the case like Neil just said, I had a soup, right? I took it off the fire. Can I put the soup back on the fire or not, right? Because we know we've been talking about what you're allowed to put on the fire in the first place, right? It's like it had to be solid, not liquid. Remember, we talked about that. So now, what if it was on the fire on Shabbat? You took it off. Can you put it back on, right? So that's the question, right? So he says, if it's still hot, if it has a liquid and it's still the same temperature, or it's still above that burning hot temperature, you can put it back, provided you didn't put it down on the ground, right? So in other words, I took this pot right off the fire, right, and it's still hot, right? If I was holding it and I pour it out, no problem. But once I put it down, right, I let it go. Right now, it becomes a different problem. If I put it on the ground, right? However, if I put it on something that's not the ground, right now, what's not the ground? A chair, a table, no problem. But my countertop is the ground, right? Because it's what you would call a fixture, right? If you know your law, right? There's certain items that are built in, right? So if it's a fixture, it's like the land itself. You can't put it on that. So if you have a countertop or something that's built in, that's already like putting it on the ground. Okay, so now according to that's according to us, right? So what happens? Again, you could take it off if it stayed hot and you didn't put it on the ground. You put it on a chair or not. Says, according to the Ashkenazim, you need even more. According to the Ashkenazim, you need to either you have to hold it in your hand and not let it out of your hand, and you have to have it in your head when you took it off that I'm putting it back on. We don't need either of those things. The Ashkenazim are more strict about this. Of course, all this was talking about something that's liquid, right? We already said about something that's solid. Even if it wasn't on the fire, you could put it back on. So the solid is not a problem. Anyway, that's what we're going to stop with today, and we'll pick up tomorrow with a few more things related to cooking, and then we're done. I guess tomorrow is Monday, but we'll see everyone Monday. Happy Pesach Sheni.
Hazak Baruch. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.